Hey, all, EC here, and I know I made a video recently talking about the GameCube app and why it's okay for the drip feed on Switch Online because obviously largely the games are bigger. But I want to talk about why the Game Boy library kind of sucks, and I want to go over that now. But like the Game Boy in general has such a great library because the Game Boy was on the market for like a decade before it really had like the Game Boy Color really took off. So 1989 to 1997 is when the Game Boy, I believe, was on the market. And then obviously the Game Boy Color launched in 1997, and then obviously the Game Boy Advance was 2001. So in that time, there's obviously been a huge library of games made for not only the Game Boy, but also the Game Boy Color, and that's obviously showcased within the Switch Online library, except it's not really showcased that great. Now, if those who don't know, there are quite a lot of games on Switch Online for Game Boy and Game Boy Color. However, they are missing some very notable titles. For example, Mario and Yoshi, Tetris 2, Super Mario Land 3 / Wario Land, which is obviously the first Wario Land game was a Super Mario Land 3, and obviously all the mainstream Pokemon games. These are all like very obvious omissions over the years, and I understand some games will have licensing issues. There will be licensing issues with some games due to, like for example, with the Pokemon Company, for example, not being fully controlled by Nintendo, or company like Konami or Sega or Capcom or whoever they're working with, not wanting to basically license, you know, not really, well, basically license games or, work with Nintendo to bring those games over. But when it comes down to Nintendo's own first-party games like Mario and Yoshi and Super Mario Land and 3 / Wario Land, those games could easily be brought over whenever they wanted. And it also feels like Nintendo kind of like forgets Game Boy games actually on Switch Online, because has anyone else noticed that like the vast majority of first-party Game Boy games that people want to talk about are already on Switch Online, and same with Game Boy Color. But then you'll see like month-long phase where there's no updates to that app. They'll update N64, they'll update Super Nintendo, they'll update every other app, but they won't update Game Boy. And when they do update, when they do update the Game Boy, it's normally content and games that people don't really care about, and like games that kind of irrelevant to a lot of people. Like they're either some obscure third-party game no one remembers, or they're just games that people don't really care about, like Mario's Picross, which I know some people do like Mario's Picross, but I don't really see how that's like a major appeal to a lot of people. And to drop that out of Donkey Kong 94 and saying more people play Donkey Kong 94 than they did Mario's Picross, let's be real. But I like these services because they actually show like a breadth of obscure and classic retro games that many people don't really remember or are very hard to find nowadays. But also when you have situations like with, say, for example, Donkey Kong Country, because Donkey Kong Country had a Game Boy Color version as well as Super Nintendo, as well as a Game Boy Advance version, would they ever release that on Switch Online? Would they just pretend that version did not exist because obviously they already have two other versions of the game that they could put on the service? In fact, they already have the Super Nintendo version on the service. But genuinely, to me, it's not that the Game Boy app doesn't really have the content. It's more so the fact that Nintendo seems to just forget the Game Boy app exists. They seem to forget Game Boy is actually on the Switch Online service. They seem to forget that, they can just consistently add more Game Boy games, because Game Boy has probably got the biggest library of games out of all the other consoles because of how long it was on the market for. And how they loop Game Boy and Game Boy Color into one platform is kind of very basic. Like I said, you've got games like Tetris 2, you've got games like Mario and Yoshi, you've got games like Wario Land / Super Mario Land 3. These games could easily be added to the Switch Online service, and obviously they're not available. And also getting the Pokemon games, for example, I've made loads of videos about Pokemon, the obscure Pokemon games and stuff, but like the classic Pokemon games, putting them on the Switch Online service, like that would get a huge amount of attention. I know the licensing fees would probably be ludicrous, and the Pokemon Company probably wouldn't want to play ball, but that would just genuinely be an awesome way of sort of just finalizing Switch Online as a platform and really like showing the Game Boy library is more than just Mario and some obscure games from the 80s. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you guys think. Do you guys agree? Do you think the Game Boy app kind of sucks? Do you think the Game Boy is kind of great? Let me know what you think about the Game Boy app or Switch Online in the comments down below. What games do you want to see on the service from Nintendo? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. It can be anything, any game that isn't already on Switch Online as a service. Let me know what you think. I've been EC and I'm signing out. Peace.